The world of the ultra-wealthy is often perceived as a sanctuary of limitless possibilities, yet for Eleanor Vance, it had become a meticulously curated cage. She was a woman who had spent 42 years learning that the only thing money could not purchase was the one thing she craved with a desperation that bordered on the religious, absolute, unshakable safety. Eleanor sat in the center of her command hub, a room she called the sanctum, located in the bowels of her clifftop estate, the Obsidian Spire. The room was climate-controlled to a constant 68 degrees, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive hardware. Before her glowed a semicircle of 650-inch, ultra-high-definition monitors, casting a pale, ghostly blue light over her. Sharp features. The spire was a masterpiece of modern architecture. 12,000 square feet of glass, steel, and granite perched precariously over the crashing surf of the Northern California coast. But to Eleanor, it was primarily a data collection engine. She had spent $2.3 million transforming this home into a surveillance fortress. There were 31 cameras in total, each capable of 8K resolution, equipped with infrared night vision and thermal imaging. They weren't just cameras, they were the eyes of an advanced AI facial recognition system that Eleanor herself had helped design through her firm, Aegis Systems. The software was so sophisticated it could detect micro-expressions, the fleeting twitch of a lip, the involuntary dilation of a pupil, indicators of deception that the human eye would miss. She believed, with a conviction that felt like a physical weight in her chest, that if she could see everything, nothing could ever hurt her again. Total visibility was the only antidote to total vulnerability. It was 3:47 a.m. Outside, the Pacific fog rolled in like a living, breathing entity, swallowing the jagged rocks 200 feet below. Inside the house was a tomb of silence, save for the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the server racks. Eleanor's eyes were fixed on camera 14, which covered the west wing corridor. On the screen, a figure moved. It was Silas Thorne, the night janitor. He was a man in his mid-40s, tall and lean, dressed in a faded charcoal uniform that Eleanor provided. He had been working at the spire for nearly 2 months, arriving at 11 p.m. and departing at 7 a.m., 5 nights a week. Silas was a widower, a former accountant who had walked away from a career in numbers to clean floors so he could be home during the day for his 10-year-old daughter, Maya. Eleanor watched as Silas stopped in front of a specific portrait at the end of the hall. It was an oil painting of Lydia Vance, Eleanor's mother, captured 6 months before her death. Lydia was depicted sitting in a sun-drenched garden, wearing a silk dress the color of a summer sky, a soft, knowing smile playing on her lips. For the 18th night in a row, Silas did not clean the frame. He did not polish the brass sconce above it. He simply stood there, motionless, his head tilted slightly as if listening. Then, his lips began to move. He was speaking to the painting, a whispered, private conversation that Eleanor's directional microphones, despite their staggering cost, could never quite capture over the ambient noise of the ventilation system. After a few moments, Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn, leather notebook. He flipped to a marked page and began to write. Eleanor leaned so close to the monitor that her breath fogged the glass. She adjusted the zoom, trying to catch the movement of his pen, but the angle was always off, the shadow of his hand obscuring the ink. He wrote with a trembling precision, then closed the book, pressed it briefly against his chest in a gesture of profound intimacy, and checked his watch. 3:51 a.m. As always, he turned and walked away, his footsteps swallowed by the expensive Persian runner. The question that consumed Eleanor wasn't what Silas was doing, it was why a complete stranger would treat her mother's image with the reverence of a man visiting a holy shrine. Lydia Vance had been dead for 5 years. Silas Thorne had never met her. He was a man from a different world, a world of dented sedans and ironed khakis, and yet he seemed to possess a key to a door Eleanor didn't even know existed. The thing about surveillance, Eleanor had learned, was that it promised clarity, but delivered only a more refined version of obsession. More cameras meant more footage to analyze. More angles meant more contradictions to cross-reference. She had built spreadsheets tracking Silas's every movement down to the second. She knew he emptied the kitchen trash at 1:14 a.m. She knew he spent exactly 12 minutes dusting the library, lingering over the astronomy section. She knew he checked his phone twice during his 2:30 a.m. break, once at 2:32 and once at 2:46, likely checking on his sleeping daughter. None of the data explained the portrait. The obsession with seeing had started 5 years ago in a sterile hospital cafeteria in Boston. Eleanor remembered the smell of burnt coffee and the taste of a stale croissant. She had been reading emails on her phone, distracted by a merger, while 3 floors above, her mother underwent routine surgery. It was a gallbladder removal, a textbook procedure with a 97% success rate. The surgeon had been confident. The anesthesiologist had been a veteran of 20 years. "Don't worry so much, sweetheart," Lydia had told her in the pre-op room, her hand warm and steady. "I'll see you in a few hours." But the hours passed, and Lydia didn't wake up. Somewhere between the operating room and the recovery suite, a decimal point had moved. A dose of 0.5 milligrams of a potent sedative had been recorded as 5.0 milligrams. A mistake so small it could fit on the head of a pin, yet so catastrophic it stopped a human heart. Eleanor had been stirring cream into her coffee when the code blue crackled over the intercom. She had looked up with the detached concern of a stranger, never imagining that the emergency involved the only person who truly loved her. The subsequent lawsuit had lasted 14 months. The hospital called it a complication. The surgeon called it unfortunate. The administrators offered a multi-million-dollar settlement, contingent on a non-disclosure agreement that would bury the truth in a shallow grave of legal jargon. Eleanor had refused. She hired investigators, forensic accountants, and malpractice specialists. She demanded every log, every camera feed, every scrap of paper. She discovered that the anesthesiologist had made similar clerical errors twice before, but the hospital had paid those families to stay silent. Her mother was the third victim, and the only reason the truth came to light was because of a nurse named Sarah Miller. Sarah had kept a personal log, a record of the truth that didn't exist in the official hospital database. She had sat in a witness box, her voice trembling, but her gaze fixed, and told the court that the system had failed Lydia Vance. Long before the needle ever touched her skin, Sarah lost her job for that testimony. She was blacklisted by the regional medical board. Her career evaporated in the heat of her integrity. The jury awarded Eleanor $8.5 million. She didn't keep a cent. She used it to found the Vance Initiative for Transparency, a foundation that protected whistleblowers and funded medical logging technology. She helped Sarah Miller relocate to California and regain her nursing license. But winning the lawsuit didn't bring Lydia back. It didn't fill the silence of the mansion Eleanor had bought to escape the memories. It only taught Eleanor one brutal lesson. The world was governed by chaos and incompetence, and the only way to survive was to watch. So, she built the spire. She hired people like Silas Thorne, people who were quiet, people who had gaps in their resumes that suggested they knew what it was like to lose everything. She preferred the silence of employees to the noise of friends. Connection was a risk, data was a certainty. Yet, as she watched Silas disappear down the service stairs on the monitor, Eleanor felt a tremor of something she hadn't felt in years, doubt. Her cold coffee sat untouched beside her keyboard. The timestamp in the corner of camera 14 read 4:14 a.m. In less than 3 hours, Silas would clock out, drive away in his rusted Honda, and return to a life Eleanor knew only through background checks and credit reports. She told herself she was watching him for security. She told herself she was being thorough, a responsible homeowner protecting her assets. But in the quietest hours of the morning, when the fog pressed against the glass like a ghost, Eleanor knew the truth. She wasn't watching Silas because she distrusted him. She was watching him because he seemed to be talking to someone who was gone, while Eleanor, surrounded by the most sophisticated communication technology on the planet, couldn't even remember the sound of her mother's voice without a digital recording. She reached out and touched the screen, her finger resting on the frozen image of Silas's back. "Who are you talking to?" she whispered to the empty room. The monitors offered no answer. They only showed the empty corridor, the silent portrait, and the unwavering red light of the recording indicator. The glass fortress was perfect. It saw everything. And yet, Eleanor had never felt more blind. She realized then that she had a choice. She could stay in the sanctum, analyzing the pixels of a stranger's life, or she could step out of the shadows and face the one thing her cameras could never capture, the reason why. But for Eleanor Vance, stepping out meant letting go of the controls. It meant walking into a hallway where there were no monitors to protect her, only the cold granite floors and the weight of a secret that had been whispered into the dark at 3:47 every morning. She stood up, her joints stiff from hours of sitting. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, irregular rhythm. She took a deep breath, the filtered air, tasting of nothing, and walked toward the heavy steel door of the sanctum. The steel door of the sanctum hissed open, a sound like a weary intake of breath. Eleanor Vance stepped out into the main corridor of the obsidian spire, leaving behind the cool, ozone-scented air of her surveillance hub for the vast, hollow silence of the mansion. It was 4:18 a.m. Silas Thorne had already moved from the west wing to the service levels to store his equipment, yet his presence lingered in the air like a faint, chemical ghost. The scent was always the same, a sharp, artificial lemon, cleaner mixed with the cold, metallic tang of polished brass. To anyone else it would have smelled like cleanliness. To Eleanor, it was the scent of a man who moved through her world like a shadow, leaving only trails of sanitized surfaces behind. She walked toward the west wing, her bare feet silent on the heated granite floors. In the sanctum, the house was a series of two-dimensional grids, a collection of pixels and timestamps. Out here, it was a cathedral of shadows. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered no comfort. They only framed the suffocating gray of the coastal fog, making the spire feel like a ship adrift in a sea of nothingness. When she reached Camera 14's territory, she stopped. This was the spot. She stood exactly where Silas had stood moments before. She looked up at the portrait of Lydia Vance. In the dim glow of the night lights, her mother's painted eyes seemed to follow her, not with the mechanical precision of the AI sensors, but with a terrifying, soulful stillness. Eleanor reached out, her fingers hovering an inch from the canvas. Silas had stood here for 4 minutes. He had whispered. He had written. She leaned in, pressing her ear toward the wall, half expecting the stones themselves to have absorbed his words. There was nothing but the distant, rhythmic thrum of the house's lungs, the HVAC system, and the far-off roar of the ocean. What could you possibly have to say to her? Eleanor whispered. Her own voice sounded brittle, the sound of someone who hadn't spoken to a living soul in days. She looked at the floor, searching for a dropped scrap of paper, a stray hair, any physical evidence of Silas Thorne's interior life. But Silas was a professional. He left no traces. He was as meticulous as the systems that tracked him. Returning to the sanctum, Eleanor didn't go to bed. Instead, she opened Silas's employee file for the 20th time. Silas Thorne, age 45, widower. Dependent, Maya Thorne, age 10, former senior auditor at Halloway and Cross. She stared at the 3-year gap in his employment history. It was a black hole in his data. Her background check had flagged it, but she had ignored it because his references from the custodial agency were impeccable. Now, that gap felt like a personal insult. What had happened in those 3 years? Grief? A breakdown? Or something else? She pulled up the footage from his 2:30 a.m. break. Silas was sitting in the small, windowless staff break room. He had a Tupperware container with a sandwich, turkey on whole wheat, she noted, and a thermos of coffee. He ate slowly, his movements mechanical. At 2:32, he pulled out his phone. Eleanor zoomed in. The resolution was high enough to see his thumb scrolling through a photo gallery. He stopped on a picture of a young girl, Maya, sitting on a swing, her face lit with a gap-toothed grin. Silas's expression, usually a mask of neutral professionalism, softened. For 14 seconds, he looked like a man who was alive. Then, his face hardened again. He tucked the phone away. And at 2:46, he checked his watch and stood up. He lived his life by the second, just like her. The next morning, Beatrice, the estate manager, arrived at 9 a.m. Beatrice was a woman of iron gray hair and a temperament that was as efficient as a Swiss watch. She was the only person Eleanor allowed to speak to her without an appointment. "You look tired, Eleanor," Beatrice said, setting a tray of green tea and avocado toast on the study desk. She didn't call her Ms. Vance when they were alone. She had earned that right over 4 years of loyal service. "I'm working on a security audit," Eleanor replied, her eyes not leaving the monitors. Beatrice sighed, a soft sound of disapproval. "You've been auditing for 6 weeks. The house is secure. The perimeter is silent. The AI hasn't flagged a single anomaly. You're not auditing security, Eleanor. You're hunting for ghosts." Eleanor turned her chair. "The night janitor, Silas. He's deviating from his route. He spends 4 minutes at a portrait," Beatrice countered calmly. "He isn't stealing. He isn't snooping. He's looking at a painting. In a house this empty. Can you blame a man for seeking a moment of beauty? He talks to it, Beatrice. He writes in a notebook. He's hiding something. Or perhaps he's just lonely," Beatrice said, her voice softening. "He lost his wife 3 years ago. He's raising a daughter alone. Maybe he finds comfort in your mother's face. Lydia had that effect on people. She made them feel seen." "I don't pay him to feel seen," Eleanor snapped. "I pay him to maintain the spire." "You pay him to be a ghost," Beatrice corrected. "And now you're upset that the ghost has a voice. You're obsessing, Eleanor. You're barely eating. You haven't left the spire in 3 weeks. This isn't about Silas. This is about that decimal point." Eleanor flinched as if struck. The decimal point, the 0.5 that became a 5.0. It was the phantom that haunted every corner of her life. "If I had watched the monitors in that hospital," Eleanor said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration, "my mother would be alive. If I had seen the nurse's log before the surgery, I would have stopped it. Surveillance isn't an obsession, Beatrice. It's the only thing that stands between us and the next unfortunate complication." Beatrice looked at her for a long time, her eyes full of a pity that Eleanor detested. "Visibility isn't the same as understanding, Eleanor. You can watch a man for 1,000 years and never know his heart." After Beatrice left, Eleanor made a decision. If the current system couldn't provide understanding, she would upgrade the system. She called a specialist from a firm in Virginia. She didn't care about the cost. 2 days later, while Silas was off shift, a technician installed a series of laser microphones and high-frequency sensors in the West Wing. These weren't standard security tools. They were intelligence-grade equipment designed to pick up the vibrations of speech from window glass and even the fibers of a carpet. She also replaced Camera 14 with a unit that possessed a thermal sensor capable of detecting the minute heat signatures of blood flow in the face, an advanced lie detection tool. Total cost, $87,000. She waited for Monday night with the feverish anticipation of a gambler. When 11 p.m. arrived and Silas's rusted Honda pulled into the service gate, Eleanor was already in the sanctum, her fingers poised over the keyboard. The shift progressed with agonizing slowness. 11:15, foyer. Midnight, corridors. 1:30, kitchen. 2 o'clock, library. Eleanor watched the thermal feed. Silas was a cool blue, his heart rate steady, his breathing rhythmic. He was a man of total internal control. 3:17 a.m. Silas turned into the West Wing. Eleanor activated the laser microphones. The screen displayed a waveform, a jagged green line that represented the silence of the hall. Silas stopped before the portrait. He stood there for 2 minutes, his head bowed. Then he looked up. The new camera captured his face in startling detail. Eleanor could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight tremor in his jaw. His lips moved. The green line on the monitor spiked. Eleanor pressed her headphones against her ears, her breath catching in her throat. The software began to filter out the hum of the air conditioning, the distant crash of the waves. It isolated the Human frequency. A voice, rasping and low, filled her ears. Today was harder, Silas whispered. His voice was like dry leaves skittering over pavement. She asked about the stars again. I told her what you said in the garden, that we're all just made of old light. Eleanor froze. What you said in the garden. Silas reached for his notebook. He wrote for a moment, then looked back at Lydia's face. I hope you're proud of her, Silas said, his voice trembling with an emotion that the AI flagged as 84% nostalgia/grief. She doesn't know what you gave us. But I do. Every day, I look at Maya, and I see the life you made possible. I'll never be able to repay the debt, so I'll just keep the floors clean. It's the only way I know how to say thank you. Silas closed the notebook, pressed it to his chest, and walked away. Eleanor sat in the blue light of the sanctum, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She doesn't know what you gave us. Silas Thorne wasn't a stranger. He hadn't just stumbled upon the spire. He was there because of a debt to a woman who had been dead for 5 years. Eleanor's mind raced through the records. Lydia's will, her charitable donations, the medical foundation's recipients. She had audited them all. There was no Silas Thorne, no Maya Thorne. She pulled up the Sarah Miller file, the nurse who had saved her case. Sarah had moved to California. Eleanor had paid for her relocation. She had helped her find a job at a hospital in Oakland, St. Catherine's Medical. Eleanor's fingers flew across the keys. She bypassed the security protocols of St. Catherine's, a feat of digital trespassing she justified as a necessity. She searched the oncology records from 7 years ago. There it was. Patient, Sarah Thorne. Condition, stage 4 small cell lung cancer. Primary. Nurse, Sarah Miller. The room seemed to tilt. Sarah Thorne, Silas's wife. She read the logs. Sarah Thorne had been a patient during the same period. Eleanor was fighting the lawsuit in Boston. Sarah Miller, the nurse who would later testify for Eleanor, had been the one who cared for Silas's wife in her final months. In a personal note buried in the digital archive, Sarah Miller had written, "A patient is terrified. Her husband, Silas, is a man of numbers who cannot calculate a way out of this. Today, a private donor from the Brennan Foundation, the woman whose mother we lost in Boston, sent a specialist and covered the experimental palliative costs. It gave Sarah 3 months of comfort she wouldn't have had. It gave them a chance to say goodbye. Lydia Vance hadn't just been a victim of a decimal point. In the months before her surgery, she had been a secret patron. She had been funding Sarah Miller's ward. She had given Silas Thorne's wife a dignified end. Eleanor looked at the portrait on the monitor. Lydia was smiling. Silas wasn't talking to a painting. He was talking to the woman who had saved his family's peace. And Eleanor, with all her cameras and all her sensors, had spent weeks treating him like a predator. She had been looking for a decimal point error in his life, some hidden flaw that would justify her distrust. Instead, she had found the one thing her surveillance couldn't quantify, a circle of grace that began with her mother's kindness and ended with a janitor whispering to a ghost in the middle of the night. Eleanor leaned back, the headphones slipping from her ears. The waveform on the screen was flat again. Silas was back in the service wing, mopping floors that didn't need mopping, paying a debt to a woman who would never ask for it. She had spent 5 years building a fortress to keep the world out, believing that visibility was safety. But Silas Thorne had just breached her walls without firing a shot. He had shown her that she was the one who was lost, trapped in a loop of her own grief, while he was out there, living in the old light her mother had left behind. The timestamp read 4:30 a.m. For the first time in 5 years, Eleanor Vance didn't look at the other 30 cameras. She turned off the monitors. One by one, the blue screens went black, until the only light in the sanctum was the pale, honest dawn beginning to bleed through the fog outside. She stood up. She didn't want to watch anymore. She wanted to speak. But as she reached the door, she stopped. To speak to him would be to admit she had been watching. It would be to admit she had invaded the one private thing he had left. Eleanor leaned her forehead against the cold steel of the door. The whispers in the corridor were no longer a mystery, but they had left her with a question that was even more terrifying. How does a woman who only knows how to watch learn how to be seen? The darkness of the sanctum was no longer a refuge. It had become a tomb. Eleanor Vance sat in the silence, the black glass of the deactivated monitors, reflecting her own hollowed-out expression. 4 or 5 years, the blue glow of these screens had been her heartbeat, a rhythmic assurance that the world was categorized, indexed, and under her thumb. Now, the absence of that light felt like a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made the very air of the obsidian spire feel thin. She had found the answer she was looking for, but it wasn't the one she had prepared for. She had expected a plot, a thief, a charlatan using her mother's memory as a crowbar to pry into her fortune. Instead, she had found a debt of grace. Silas Thorne wasn't a threat. He was a living testament to a side of her mother Eleanor had been too busy or too guarded to truly see. Eleanor's mind kept looping back to Silas's voice through the laser microphones. She doesn't know what you gave us. The irony was a jagged pill. Eleanor, the queen of surveillance, the woman who sold Aegis to the world as the ultimate tool for clarity, was the only one in the dark. Silas knew her mother's heart better than she did, and he knew it because he had experienced it in the raw, unmonitored trenches of a dying wife's hospital room. She stood up, her legs cramping from hours of stillness. She needed to move, but where? Every inch of the spire was covered by the very cameras she now feared to look at. She felt the gaze of her own creation, the 8K lenses, the thermal sensors, the AI that was constantly calculating her stress markers. For the first time, she understood the biological toll of being watched. It was a low-level radiation of the soul, a constant stripping away of the right to be a mystery even to oneself. The sun began to rise, not with a burst of gold, but with a sullen, bruised purple that filtered through the persistent Northern California fog. Eleanor walked to the kitchen, her movements stiff. She bypassed the automated espresso machine and stood at the sink, staring out at the white abyss beyond the glass. A soft chime echoed through the house. It was the internal security alert. She didn't return to the sanctum. Instead, she pulled her tablet from the marble counter. It was a message from Philip Warner, the CFO of Aegis Systems. Eleanor, we need to talk. The board is flagging the Obsidian audit expenses. You've spent nearly $100,000 on intelligence-grade hardware for a private residence in the last 72 hours. Shareholders are asking questions about your focus. We have the quarterly review in 48 hours. Please tell me you're coming in. Eleanor deleted the message. The Obsidian audit was what she had called her obsession with Silas. To the board, she was a genius who was perhaps becoming a recluse. To Philip, she was a liability. They saw the spire as a distraction, not realizing it was the only thing keeping her sane. Or so she had thought. By mid-morning, the house was in its daytime rhythm. The cleaning agency's day crew arrived, 3 women in blue tunics who moved with a cheerful, loud energy that Eleanor usually found intolerable. Today, she found it terrifying. She watched them from the shadows of the mezzanine, seeing how they laughed and bumped shoulders, how they existed without a second thought for the cameras. Tucked into the crown molding. Ms. Vance. Eleanor jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Beatrice was standing at the base of the stairs, looking up at her with a concerned frown. I didn't hear you come in, Beatrice. The front door logged me in at 9:02, Eleanor. You would have known that if you were in your room. Beatrice climbed the stairs, her eyes scanning Eleanor's face. You look like you've seen a ghost. Or stopped being one. I turned off the West Wing feeds, Eleanor said, her voice a dry rasp. Beatrice stopped on the landing. A slow smile spread across her face. Truly? What? Because there's nothing to see, Eleanor lied. It was a waste of processing power. Beatrice's smile faded, replaced by a keen, analytical look. She had been with Eleanor long enough to know when the truth was being polished. Is that so? Then, perhaps you're ready to hear the bad news. What bad news? I was doing the weekly inventory of the display cases in the library, Beatrice said, her voice dropping an octave. The Victorian ruby brooch. Your mother's favorite. The one from the 20th anniversary gift. Eleanor felt a cold shiver. What about it? It's gone, Eleanor. The case is locked, the seal is intact, but the velvet is empty. The world seemed to sharpen into a singular, painful point of focus. The ruby brooch. It was worth $85,000 on paper, but to Eleanor it was one of the few physical tethers she had left to the woman in the painting. When was it last seen? Eleanor asked, her voice turning cold, the old habits of the investigator snapping back into place. 3 days ago, during the Tuesday cleaning, Beatrice replied. The day crew was here, and Silas was here overnight. The name landed like a blow. Silas. Everything Eleanor had learned the night before, the gratitude, the secret, charity, the old light, was suddenly clouded by the oldest, simplest motive in the world, theft. Had she been played? Had the whispers and the notebook been a performance for a woman he knew was watching? Had he discovered the cameras and decided to give her a story while he picked her pockets? Check the logs, Eleanor commanded, her voice regaining its steel. I want every entry and exit from the library for the last 72 hours. Cross-reference it with the weight sensor plates under the display case. Eleanor, wait, Beatrice said, reaching out to touch her arm. Think for a moment. If Silas took it, why would he stay? He was here last night. He'll be here tonight. Because he's arrogant. Eleanor spat, pulling her arm away. Because he thinks. I'm so distracted by my ghosts that I won't notice a missing trinket. He thinks he's invisible. She retreated to the sanctum, her hands shaking as she hammered at the keys. She reactivated the monitors. The blue light flooded the room, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a spotlight. She pulled up the library footage. She skipped through the hours, her eyes burning. She saw the day crew dusting the cases. She saw herself walking through the room at 2 a.m. 2 nights ago, a shadow among shadows. Then she found Silas. He entered the library at 2:05 a.m. He moved with his usual methodical grace. He dusted the shelves. He straightened the astronomy books. He moved toward the display case. Eleanor held her breath. Silas reached out, his cloth hovering over the glass. He paused. He looked at the brooch for a long time. His face was unreadable. Then he moved on. He didn't open the case. He didn't even touch the lock. She rewound it. She watched it in slow motion. She enhanced the contrast. There was no sleight of hand, no suspicious bulge in his pocket. Then who? She whispered. She checked the day crew. 3 women, all with clean records. They worked in a pod. They were never alone in the library. The security logs showed no unauthorized entries. The spire was a closed loop. If the brooch was gone, someone inside had taken it. She spent the afternoon in a fever of data. She pulled the financial records of every employee. She searched for gambling debts, for sudden influxes of cash, for desperate emails. She found nothing. Everyone was stable. Everyone was exactly who they claimed to be, except for the Aegis itself. As she delved deeper into the system's back end, the part of the software she usually left to her engineers, she found a tiny, flickering anomaly. A ghost command had been executed 4 days ago. Someone had bypassed the libraries weight sensors for a 90-second window. It was a sophisticated override, the kind of thing only someone with high-level access could do. Her heart stopped. High-level access. She pulled the external login logs. There, in the metadata, was an encrypted IP address. She traced it, her fingers flying with a vengeful speed. The trace led, not to a pawn shop or a thief's den, but to a server in downtown San Francisco. The corporate offices of Aegis Systems. Philip Warner. Eleanor leaned back, the air escaping her lungs in a long, shaky hiss. Philip wasn't just worried about her focus. He was testing her. Or worse, he was framing the unstable CEO to force a competency review. If an heirloom went missing under her nose, and she couldn't find it despite her millions in surveillance, it would be the final proof the board needed to oust her. The missing brooch wasn't a theft. It was a decimal point error of a different kind. A calculated move to delete her from her own company. She looked at the monitor showing camera 14. Silas Thorne was not on screen yet. It was only 7 p.m., but she realized that Silas was the only person in her life who wasn't trying to take something from her. He was the only one who was there to give something back. The realization broke something inside her. The illusion of control she had cultivated was total. She had watched the wrong people. She had built a fortress to keep out the world, only to find that the traitors were already holding the keys, and the predator she had hunted was actually the only person who remembered her mother's soul. She stood up. She didn't want to wait for Silas to arrive so she could watch him on a screen. She didn't want to analyze his heart through a thermal sensor. She walked to the kitchen. She sat at the island, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of tea. She waited. At 11 p.m., the service entrance chimed. The electronic tablet logged Silas in. Eleanor heard his footsteps, the real sound, not the digitized version through the speakers. He went to the utility closet. He began his routine. At 12:45 a.m., the door to the kitchen swung open. Silas entered, pushing his cleaning cart. He stopped abruptly when he saw her. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the under-cabinet LEDs. Eleanor looked at him, seeing the man, not the pixels. He looked older in person, more tired. His charcoal uniform was slightly too big for his frame. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice the same rasping low she had heard through the glass. "I apologize. I didn't realize you were still up." "I couldn't sleep, Silas," Eleanor said. Her voice felt heavy. "I've been thinking about the stars." Silas froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him a pale, ghostly gray. He knew. He knew she had heard him. "I have 31 cameras in this house, Silas," Eleanor said, her voice steady, but devoid of its usual sharp edge. "I have microphones that can hear a heartbeat. I've been watching you for 6 weeks." The silence that followed was absolute. Silas didn't move. He didn't get angry. He simply looked at her with a profound, weary disappointment that hurt worse than any accusation. "Is that what you call it?" Silas asked quietly. "Security? I call it safety," Eleanor replied. "I call it making sure I'm never blindsided again." "And what did you see, Ms. Vance, when you were looking through your glass?" "I saw a man who speaks to a woman he never met. I saw a man who thinks he owes a debt to a ghost." Silas set down his cleaning cloth. He walked toward the island, stopping a respectful distance away. "I don't owe a debt to a ghost. I owe a debt to a woman who chose to be kind when she had every reason to be selfish. Your mother didn't just pay for my wife's care. She wrote to her. She sent Maya books. She gave us a world where Sarah wasn't just a case number." He looked around the high-tech kitchen, at the cameras tucked into the corners. "You've built a masterpiece, Ms. Vance. You can see everything. But you're the most blindsided person I've ever met." "A brooch is missing, Silas," Eleanor said, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. "My mother's ruby. My board of directors took it to prove I'm incompetent. They're going to use my surveillance against me to show I couldn't even protect my own house." Silas looked at her for a long time. Then, he did something Eleanor didn't expect. He sat down at the stool across from her. "I was an auditor for 6 years, Silas said. I know how people hide things in plain sight. If your board took it, they didn't take it out of the house. That's too risky. They hid it here, somewhere you'd eventually fail to find it." "Why would you help me?" Eleanor asked. "I spied on you. I invaded your grief." Silas looked at the kitchen clock. 3:17 a.m. was approaching. "Because Lydia Vance wouldn't have watched me through a camera," Silas said. "She would have sat here and asked me my name. And because Maya needs to grow up in a world where the old light doesn't go out just because someone is scared." He stood up and held out his hand, not to touch her, but to lead the way. "Let's find your mother's brooch, Eleanor." Without the cameras. In that moment, the illusion of control shattered completely. Eleanor Vance stood up and walked out of the kitchen with Silas Thorne. She didn't look at the monitors. She didn't check her tablet. She stepped out into the shadows of her own home, finally realizing that the only way to truly see was to stop watching and start being present in the dark. The silence of the West Wing was no longer a digital construct filtered through high-fidelity speakers. It was a heavy, physical presence that pressed against Eleanor's skin. As she walked beside Silas Thorne, she realized she had forgotten how to navigate her own home without the aid of a glowing blue map. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner more profound. Without the cameras to flatten the world into a two-dimensional grid, The spire felt like an ancient, breathing beast. Silas moved with a quiet, grounded confidence. He didn't need the light. He had memorized the house through the friction of a polishing cloth and the rhythmic sweep of a broom. He didn't look at the crown molding for hidden lenses. He looked at the floor, reading the house through its physical textures. "Surveillance is a trick of the mind, Ms. Vance," Silas said, his voice barely a murmur. "It makes you believe you are looking at the world, but you are really just looking at a recording of it. You look for movement. You look for the anomaly. But the truth usually hides in the things that stay perfectly still." "I built this place to be the absolute end of secrets," Eleanor replied. Her hands were shoved deep into the pockets of her cardigan, her fingers twitching. "I thought if I could eliminate the unseen, I could eliminate the unexpected. And yet, you missed a theft in your own library. And you missed the fact that your mother was a different person than you remembered." They reached the West Wing corridor. The portrait of Lydia Vance awaited them at the far end, bathed in the soft, amber glow of the wall sconces. In the physical space, without the magnification of the 8K lenses, the painting looked smaller, more fragile. But the smile, that knowing, gentle curve of the lips, felt more directed, more personal. Silas stopped a few feet from the painting. He looked at Eleanor. "Before we find the brooch, you need to know the real secret of this portrait. It's why I come here. It's not just because she helped my wife. It's because she left me a map." "A map to what?" Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn leather notebook. He didn't hide it this time. He handed it to Eleanor. The leather was warm, smelling of cedar and old paper. Eleanor opened it. The first few pages were Silas's own handwriting, logs of Maya's school days, grocery lists, grocery tallies. But as she flipped toward the middle, the script changed. It became elegant, fluid, and heartbreakingly familiar. Lydia's handwriting. "She sent this to the hospital ward 2 weeks before her surgery," Silas explained. "She knew Sarah Miller was being pressured to stay silent about the other complications in the unit. Your mother wasn't just a donor, Eleanor. She was Sarah's primary source. She had been using her position as a board member at Boston Memorial to document the very system failures that eventually killed her." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her. "She never told me. She told me not to worry. She told me it was textbook. She didn't want you to be afraid," Silas said softly. "She wanted to fix it herself so you wouldn't have to live in a world of fortresses. The last entry in that book, she wrote it for you, but she gave it to Sarah Thorne to hold, in case the textbook didn't go as planned. She trusted my wife because they were both facing the end with their eyes open." Eleanor turned to the last page. "To my Ellie," the ink was slightly faded. "If you are reading this, it means the system was more broken than I could mend. Do not build a wall around your heart to honor me. The truth isn't found in a log. It is found in the people who are brave enough to tell it. Look behind the garden, my love. That is where the peace is." "I spent years looking for the garden," Silas said. "I thought it was a metaphor, until I realized Philip Warner was too interested in the library." Eleanor's auditor brain clicked into gear. "The library, the mural behind the mahogany shelves. It's a depiction of the hanging gardens." "Exactly," Silas said. "Philip helped you design the security architecture. He knows every blind spot. He knows that you never look at the dead data, books you've already indexed but never read. If he wanted to frame you for incompetence, he'd hide the brooch in a place the AI ignores because it's static." They turned and headed toward the library. Eleanor felt a cold rage beginning to replace her shock. Philip Warner had been her father's protege. He had stood by her at Lydia's funeral. He had sat in the sanctum with her, praising the Aegis system, all while knowing he was using her grief to build her a gilded cage. They entered the library. The room was vast, the scent of leather-bound books, and floor wax heavy in the air. Eleanor walked to the mural of the gardens. It was a beautiful, intricate piece of art, but to her eyes now, it looked like a shroud. "The AI filters out the bookshelves unless a sensor is tripped," Eleanor whispered. "Philip wouldn't trip a sensor. He'd use a bypass code he wrote into the kernel." She looked at the astronomy section. "Look behind the garden." She reached for a heavy, dust-covered volume titled The Architecture of Light. It was a book her father had cherished. She pulled it from the shelf. Behind it, in a small, hollowed-out compartment in the wood, a space designed for a hidden fire lever that had been decommissioned, lay a small velvet pouch. Eleanor's breath hitched. She pulled out the pouch and opened it. The Victorian ruby brooch spilled into her palm. It caught the dim light, the deep red stones glowing like embers. It was cold, heavy, and indisputable. Philip hadn't just stolen it. He had placed it in the one spot that would prove Eleanor's surveillance was a failure. If she couldn't find her own mother's treasure in her own perfect house, the board would have the legal grounds to declare her mentally unfit and seize control of Aegis. He was going to discover it during the review tomorrow, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. He would have walked in here with the auditors and pointed to this shelf. He would have shown them that I was so lost in my monitors that I couldn't see the theft happening right in front of me. He underestimated one thing, Silas said. What? He thought you were alone. He thought you had successfully replaced people with cameras. Eleanor looked at the brooch, then at Silas, the man she had treated as a data point, the man she had spied on. He had saved her, not because he wanted her money, but because he was a man of integrity living in the old light of her mother's grace. I'm going to destroy him, Silas, Eleanor said, but there was no joy in the thought. But first, I'm going to destroy the sanctum. You don't have to destroy it, Silas said. You just have to stop living inside it. Eleanor shook her head. No, the sanctum is a lie. It's a decimal point error. That's been running for 5 years. It promised me safety, but it only gave me isolation. It made me a stranger to my mother's memory and a predator to my friends. She walked to the library desk and picked up the internal phone. She didn't call security. She called Philip Warner's private cell. He answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep. Eleanor? It's 3:45 a.m. Is everything okay? I found the brooch, Philip, Eleanor said. Her voice was as cold as the Pacific, and I found the bypass codes in the kernel. I'm standing here with Silas Thorne. You remember Silas? The man you thought was an untraceable variable? There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. Eleanor, I don't know what you're talking about. The police are on their way, Philip. Not for the theft, but for the corporate espionage and the fraud. I've already sent the kernel logs to the board's independent auditors. You thought I was looking at the cameras, Philip. You forgot that I'm the one who wrote the code. She hung up. She turned to Silas. I'm firing the cleaning agency. I'm firing the security firm. I'm keeping Beatrice, and I'm keeping the spire, but the cameras are coming down. What will you do with the house? Silas asked. Eleanor looked at the notebook Lydia had left behind. Look behind the garden. That is where the piece is. I'm going to turn the west wing into a residence, Eleanor said. For Maya. For you. If you'll stay. Not as a janitor, Silas. As the director of the Vance Initiative. We're going to stop watching people and start protecting them. The way my mother wanted. Silas looked at the portrait of Lydia Vance in the distance. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. The first one Eleanor had seen that wasn't through a screen. I think Maya would like the stars out here, Silas said. They're much clearer when you aren't looking at them through a lens. Eleanor Vance walked to the west wing. She didn't look at camera 14. She stood in front of her mother's portrait, and for the first time in 5 years, she didn't analyze the pixels. She simply stood there, a daughter in the presence of her mother's secret, and whispered the 2 words that the Aegis system could never have predicted. Thank you. The glass fortress was still standing, but the woman inside was finally free. The decimal point had been corrected. The audit was over. And as the sun finally broke through the California fog, the obsidian spire was no longer a prison of surveillance, but a home, lit by the honest, unrecorded light of a new day. The arrest of Philip Warner was not a televised event, nor was it the dramatic climax Eleanor Vance had once imagined for her enemies. It happened in the gray, liminal space of a Tuesday morning, just as the fog began to retreat from the jagged cliffs of the obsidian spire. There were no sirens. Eleanor had requested a quiet intervention to avoid traumatizing Maya, who was still asleep in the Thorne's modest apartment miles away. Instead, there were only the muffled clicks of handcuffs and the low hum of unmarked black sedans. Eleanor stood on the balcony, her hands gripping the cold granite railing. She was watching the scene with her own eyes, not through a 8K lens or a thermal sensor. The raw, unmediated reality of it was startlingly vivid. The way the ocean spray dampened the detectives' coats, the genuine, trembling fear on Philip's face as he was led away. He had looked up once, his eyes searching the glass facade of the spire for the woman who had been his protégé, his prey, and, eventually, his undoing. Eleanor didn't wave. She didn't gloat. She simply stood there, a witness to the consequences of a life built on bypass codes and betrayal. When the cars disappeared down the winding driveway, a profound silence settled over the estate. For the first time in 5 years, the spire felt truly empty, not because of a lack of people, but because the invisible web of tension that had held its walls together had finally snapped. Silas Thorne walked out onto the balcony, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply stood beside her, the steam from the mugs curling into the morning air. "He's gone," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "He's gone," Eleanor repeated. "But the system he helped me build is still here. Every camera, every microphone, every sensor. It's all still recording, Silas. It's all still watching us." "Then let's start with the sanctum," Silas said. "The brain first. The rest will follow." The dismantling of the surveillance state within the obsidian spire took 3 days. It was a physical, grueling labor that Eleanor insisted on performing. Alongside the technicians, she wanted to feel the weight of the cameras in her hands. She wanted to hear the snap of the cables as they were severed. Each lens removed felt like a cataract being lifted from her vision. The sanctum, once a room of absolute clarity, was transformed into a graveyard of hardware. Monitors were stacked like tombstones, server racks were bled of their data and unbolted from the floor. Eleanor watched as the blue light that had defined her life for half a decade was extinguished, replaced by the warm, flickering light of a few simple lamps. "I feel exposed," she admitted to Silas on the second night. They were sitting on the floor of the now gutted sanctum, surrounded by copper wiring and empty brackets. "It's like I've spent years wearing armor, and now I'm walking out into a storm in my skin." "Trust is a kind of exposure," Silas replied. He was cleaning a smudge of grease from his hand. "You spent 5 years trying to prevent the unexpected. But the unexpected is also where the joy comes from. You can't have one without the other, Eleanor. You either live in a fortress where nothing changes, or you live in the world where anything can happen." The anything happened on the 4th day. Maya Thorne arrived at the spire. She was a small, vibrant girl with her father's thoughtful eyes and a smile that seemed to defy the gravity of the mansion's imposing architecture. She arrived in the rusted Honda, carrying a backpack covered in Galaxy stickers and a telescope wrapped in a faded quilt. Eleanor met them at the front door. She had spent hours worrying about what to say, how to act. She hadn't been around a child in years. She felt clumsy, her social muscles atrophied by long periods of digital isolation. "Hi," Maya said, looking up at the vaulted ceiling with wide eyes. "Is this a castle?" "My dad said it was a spire, but it looks like a castle from a movie." "It's just a house, Maya," Eleanor said, kneeling so she was at the girls' level. "A very big, very quiet house. But I'm hoping you can help us make it a bit louder." Maya looked at Eleanor, her gaze surprisingly piercing. "Are you the lady who looks at the stars?" Eleanor glanced at Silas, who gave a small, encouraging nod. "I used to look at things through screens, Maya. But your dad told me you like the real thing. Would you like to see the West Wing? There's a balcony there that has the best view of the North Star." As Maya ran ahead, guided by Silas, Eleanor felt a strange, sharp ache in her chest. It was the pain of a heart re-inflating after years of being compressed. The spire was no longer a fortress, it was a home. And with that transition came a terrifying, beautiful responsibility. The next few weeks were a period of surveillance withdrawal. Eleanor found herself reaching for her tablet in the middle of the night, wanting to check the perimeter, wanting to see the thermal signature of the hallway to ensure Silas and Maya were safe. Habit was a powerful ghost. She would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that because she couldn't see them on a screen, they had vanished. She would have to force herself to get out of bed, walk down the hall, and listen for the sound of Silas's quiet snoring or Maya's rhythmic breathing. Through the door. This was the old light, in practice, the courage to believe in the existence of things you weren't currently monitoring. In the corporate world, the fallout was swifter. The board of Aegis Systems, once eager to oust her, was now scrambling to distance themselves from Philip Warner. Eleanor returned to the San Francisco office for one final meeting. She didn't go in a power suit. She wore a simple sweater and slacks. She didn't bring a presentation. She brought the leather notebook Silas had given her. Aegis is pivoting, Eleanor told the room of stunned executives. We are no longer a surveillance company. We are an accountability firm. We are releasing the Aegis kernel as open-source software for medical and governmental transparency. We will provide the tools for people to watch the systems that govern them, rather than allowing the systems to watch the people. Eleanor, the profit margins, one director began. The profit margins are a decimal point error in a world where people are dying because of hidden mistakes, Eleanor interrupted. Philip tried to use this system to steal a brooch and a company. I used it to steal my own soul back. I'm stepping down as CEO. Philip's seat will be taken by Sarah Miller, the nurse who stood up for my mother. And Silas Thorne will head our new ethics and accountability division. She walked out of the boardroom without looking back. She felt lighter than she had in her entire adult life. Back at the Spire, the West Wing had been transformed. The West Wing corridor, once the site of Eleanor's most intense obsession, was now Maya's playroom and study. The portrait of Lydia Vance remained, but it was no longer a target for a laser microphone. It was simply a picture of a grandmother Maya would never know, but whose legacy was the very reason she had a bedroom with a view of the sea. One evening, Eleanor found Maya standing in front of the portrait. The girl was holding a flashlight, pointing it at the canvas to see the brushstrokes. She looks happy, Maya said. Why is she smiling like she has a secret? Eleanor sat on the floor beside her. Because she did have a secret, Maya. She knew that even when things seem very dark, there are people who will choose to be kind. She knew that trust is a risk, but it's the only risk worth taking. My dad says you saved us, Maya whispered, turning the flashlight off. No, Maya, Eleanor said, pulling the girl into a side hug. Your dad saved me. He reminded me how to see in the dark. The final act of the transformation was the garden. Eleanor had the decommissioned security cables pulled up from the soil and replaced with irrigation lines. She and Silas spent an entire weekend planting lavender, roses, and jasmine, the flowers Lydia had loved. They worked until their fingernails were caked with dirt and their backs ached. As the sun began to set on that final Sunday, Eleanor stood in the center of the garden. The air was thick with the scent of sea salt and blooming jasmine. There were no cameras here. There were no microphones. There was only the sound of Silas laughing as Maya tried to chase a butterfly and the rhythmic, ancient crashing of the Pacific against the cliffs. Eleanor looked up at the obsidian spire. It was no longer a fortress of glass and steel. It was a lighthouse. It was a place where secrets had been aired and shadows had been chased away by the honest, unrecorded light of the sun. She thought of the decimal point that had started it all, the 0.5 that became a 5.0. It had been an error of precision, a mistake born of a system that valued numbers over people. She realized now that life wasn't meant to be precise. It was meant to be messy, unpredictable, and vulnerable. Trust was the correction of that error. Trust was the decimal point moved back to where it belonged. Silas walked over to her, wiping his brow. The telescope is set up on the balcony. Maya found Jupiter. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, effortless expression that reached her eyes. Tell her I'm coming. I want to see the old light. As she walked back toward the house, Eleanor Vance didn't look at the shadows. She didn't check for anomalies. She simply walked into the warmth of her home, finally understanding that the greatest surveillance system ever designed could never capture the beauty of a single, unmonitored moment of peace. The glass fortress was gone. In its place stood a home, built on the courage to trust and the wisdom to know that the most important things in life are the ones you don't have to watch to believe in. Eleanor Vance was no longer the woman who saw everything. She was the woman who finally felt enough. And as the stars began to poke through the coastal fog, she realized that was all she had ever truly needed.